All right, it says we are live. Welcome here to Kingdom in Context. This is a special broadcast for the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is also considered a high Sabbath. It's a holy convocation day, and I wanted to do this live broadcast and have this special discussion with two awesome brothers because it's not only a topic that a lot of believers are trying to get a bead on and try to understand exactly the particulars, but it's a very edifying topic because of everything involved with it. So we will be discussing tonight the idea: was the Last Supper a Passover meal, or was it a meal other than the Passover meal? Just basically called a Last Supper. And in addition to that topic, it flows into the idea of how many days was Jesus actually in the tomb. And so the traditional narrative is that he is in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights, and some people contest that. And so we wanted to go over the scriptures from the start of the Last Supper meal all the way through his resurrection. And we want to kind of flesh out some of these ideas and all the little sub-ideas that go into these two main topics for this discussion. And I'm Sean Griffin. If this is your first time here to Kingdom in Context, welcome. We hope you enjoy this broadcast. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, turn it from red to gray, and then tap the little button, a little bell next to it, that way you're notified when new videos come out. And tonight, I'm joined by my good friend and brother from Canada. He's Ken Heidebrecht from Hanging on His Words. What's up, Ken?
Hey, brother. Not much, man. Just excited to have this discussion with you. And it's a discussion that I've been, not putting off, but it's been one that's been on my heart for a long time. And it's a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. It's something that when I first came into my faith seriously, sloughing some of the traditions of men through Christianity or churchianity, it was something that I was very excited to learn about. And since then, I've kind of gone back and forth on my perspective with it. And so even to this day, man, I'm not 100% sold, whereas I thought I was before. So I'm really interested to see what Brother Matthew is going to talk about and bring up, as well as you, Sean, obviously. But it's like I said, it's an awesome topic of discussion. It'll be friendly and loving, which is why I love talking with you brothers, because you just exude the fruits of the Spirit. So let's do it.
And also, we're joined by Matthew Janzen of Ministers of the New Covenant from his channel on YouTube. And Matthew, you're also a good brother and a friend. Thanks for joining us tonight on this really fun discussion. So how are you tonight, brother?
I'm glad to be here. I'm excited. I've had this discussion many times before, and I feel like this is probably going to be the most fruitful of all of the discussions that I've had on the subject because of you two brothers. But I've had some knockdown dragouts, or seen some knockdown dragouts when it comes to this discussion. So I don't think, I guess there can be some areas maybe of what we're going to talk that could cause division in maybe what we practice. But I don't think that it should be a test of fellowship to the point where if a brother sees it different, that we should shun him or put him out of the church or something like that. It's important, but I don't think it should be like a hardcore test of fellowship, like an unrepentant sin or something like that. So I'm excited. I've got a lot of information. I've taught sermons on this subject. I've written booklets, written papers. That doesn't make me right, but I've got a lot of information to put on the table and to share for people to look at and digest when they get the opportunity. So I'm glad to be here. Thanks for asking me to do this.
Awesome, Matthew. And I totally agree with you that the details of this discussion that we're going to have tonight are just that. They're just the details, but none of this is a salvific issue. So none of this will affect your faith in Yeshua as the Son of God, who brings you salvation, who can resurrect you to eternal life. And none of this is designed, none of these details should equal division amongst brethren or arguing or contentious debate that might cause disfellowshipping, because it's just the details, right? So everyone, I think most believers would already understand that the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are eyewitnesses accounts, and they already have small differences in them already because they're an eyewitness account. And this is a commonly accepted thing in history itself, is that you have multiple eyewitnesses accounts of an event. They will not line up perfectly. And even historians know that and acknowledge that. And that is a part of an actual academic process, is they don't expect them to line up perfectly, but they do expect the major, events, so to speak, and the players in the major events to line up. We do get that with the Synoptic Gospels, including John. But there are some specifics, some particulars that sometimes seem contradictory. We're going to go over some of those tonight. So it's exciting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's exciting.
Absolutely.
So right off the bat, does anybody want to just share their perspective on this topic, right? Was it the Last Supper or was it an actual Passover meal? And how many days was he in the grave? And then maybe we can start digging into some of the discrepancies between our views.
I'll go out there and I'll tell everybody. I believe that the Last Supper was not the Passover meal. I think it was a preparatory or purification. Possibly, historically, it may have been something we could call a graduation ceremony for Yeshua's disciples. I don't think the disciples knew that, or fully knew what was going to happen to Yeshua. Even Peter, I think the first time he brings it up there in the middle of Matthew's gospel, Peter, rebukes Yeshua about him being scourged and beaten or crucified or what have you. So I don't think they fully knew that Yeshua wasn't going to be eating the Passover that year. But I don't believe it was the Passover. And as far as the time period that Yeshua was in the tomb, for sake of simplification, I would believe that Yeshua was crucified on Friday and rose on Sunday. So I think he was in the tomb for 30 to 36 hours tops. So I would go along with the traditional timeline of most in Christianity today, as far as that goes.
Okay. Thanks, brother. What about you, Ken?
Yeah. And for myself, I believe that the Last Supper was a Passover meal, a feast. I'm about 70-30 on that one. And what I mean by that is I'm 70% certain that it was, 30% uncertain that it wasn't. I was 100% certain about a week ago. So that's the fun in having these discussions and doing it with brothers who are, well informed on their opinions and have done the research and stuff. So I believe that it was the Last Supper was a Passover because of the Synoptic Gospels flat out tell us. At least that's what it seems to imply in the English. So when you pull up the Greek, even in that, I believe it does, explicitly state that. Where I struggle is with John's account, and I think that's where everyone kind of struggles with if they're not 100% certain that it was a Passover or not. So I do believe it was, though, and for various reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about this evening. And I do believe that he was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights as the sign of Jonah. And as for the timing on which day of the week, I'm still working that one out, to be honest with you. So
okay,
I may have a different conclusion at the end of this discussion.
Yeah, we may all. It's awesome. So, okay. Well, thank you, Ken. So for me, I'm probably more the other side of the pendulum than Matthew, whereas I'm more 95% believing it was a Passover and he was in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, and then about 5% left open for a couple of places that I want to discuss with you guys where I struggle to reconcile some thoughts. But strangely enough, Ken, it's not John's account that trips me up. It's just 2 little verses, one in Mark and one in Luke, that trips me up. And so even and I want to show you guys the Greek about that later. And so I've actually taken the time to make a timeline chart.
Awesome.
And so if I can screen share that without putting us in danger, then I will try to do that later, because I feel like that's why I'm 95% sure, is because I put together I started placing things on a timeline chart, and I started realizing some things from Exodus and Deuteronomy as well, as far as details about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, even strangely enough from 2 Chronicles. And then it helped me with a different perspective than what I had formerly. So I'm anxious to share them with you guys tonight. It'll be fun.
Excellent. I think we can all agree, hopefully, that the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover were synonymously used in their vernacular, I guess, right? So when we see Passover being referred to in the gospel accounts, and even in, I think it's Exodus, it seems to tie them both as being like a twofold feast day that starts around the same time, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Matthew, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the context of where the word Passover is used. I think definitely when you get into the New Testament, by that time Passover was shorthand sometimes for the entire feast. If I'm remembering right, I think it's Luke 22 verse 1, where it's pretty much plain that the word Passover is used for all 7 days of unleavened bread, including the 14th. And I think it's Ezekiel 45 verse 21, where there's an Old Testament precedent where it talks about keeping the Passover a feast of 7 days. But there's some places in Scripture, obviously, where Passover is in reference to just the 14th day between the evenings when the ordinances of the Passover lamb are to be observed. So, it just depends on how it's used and what context that it's used in. But I mean, my children, when I talk to my children, I tell them Passover's coming up. They're thinking about not just the 14th, but the entire Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's how we use it in our household a lot. And I think that's how it came to be used during the time of the Yeshua in the first century.
Yeah, I know for myself, I had to go back to just going to, what we call the law, the books of Moses, where it's all recorded, all those details in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and just study it from the beginning, the roots. And it's really interesting because I know there's so many debates on everything, right? Like, when does a day start? That's
Yeah.
that's something that I've been asked to look into several times by people, and it's interesting. I've looked into it a bit, but even that plays a role in how we're going to understand when these feasts start, right?
Sure.
And so even with that, I'd like your opinion. I think we all agree that the day starts at evening, just like it says in Genesis chapter 1. There was evening, morning, first day, and then we have the consecutive days being repeated like that. And
Yes, that's the way I feel about it. Yeah. How about you, Matthew?
I agree. Yeah, I believe that days, I think there's a limited definition of day, like daylight, the hot part of the day from sunrise to sunset. But I think that days of observance, like Day of Atonement, or in Exodus 12, when it talks about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it says from the 14th day at evening to the 21st day at evening. It's referencing the 7 days of unleavened bread, and they're kept from evening to evening, just like Day of Atonement in Leviticus 23. So, yeah, we're in agreements on that for sure.
Yes, even in Exodus 12, where we get some of the first mentions of both Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Exodus 12, verse 7. Well, let's just start in verse 6, where it talks about, you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. This is, of course, talking about the sheep or the goat that they would actually sacrifice. And then you should keep it until the 14th day of the month, of the same month, and then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire. So this is equating both the word night with the twilight.
yeah,
And so this is not the use of the word twilight for the dawn breaking, but at the end of the 14th, the end of the day. That's why you keep it until the day of the 14th. And then at the end of the day at twilight, at the cresp of the 14th turn into the 15th, you're supposed to slaughter this thing, and then you eat it that night before sunup. And this is actually corroborated even more so from Jubilees 49, where it says, I think it's verse 10. It says, let the children of Israel come and observe the Passover on the day of its fixed time, on the 14th day of the first month, between the evenings, from the third part of the day to the third part of the night. For 2 portions of the day are given to the light, and the third part to the evening. And this is what the Lord commanded you, that you should observe it between the evenings. It is not permissible to slay it during any period of the light, but during the period bordering on the evening, and let them eat it at the time of the evening until the third part of the night. Whatever's left over of its flesh from the third part of the night and onwards, let it be burned with fire. So it's...
Yeah, Sean, that actually lines up with the Septuagint saying in Exodus 12, verse 6, that the children of Israel shall kill it toward evening.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
I would be different. I believe that the Passover lamb was to be slaughtered in the afternoon period of the 14th. And I would say that twilight, in like the Bible I use, the HCSB, or were you reading the New American Standard there, Sean?
Partly. And then I was also reading from Jubilees, which is just more of a... It
Right.
doesn't really have an official title, but it's translated by R.H. Charles.
Sure. So I would say twilight would be an incorrect translation. The Hebrew there in Exodus 12:6 is Bain Ha Arabim, which means between or betwixt the evenings. And I would use the Septuagint. Septuagint, I think, that says towards evening. In other words, not at evening, but towards evening would be the afternoon period. I would say this will be the same time that Yeshua was crucified, what we would call in our vernacular 3 p.m. roughly. This was the same time of what's commonly called the evening sacrifice, which actually is not the Arab sacrifice, but the Bain Ha-Arabim sacrifice. It's the second sacrifice of the day. The first one's in the morning. The second one is in the afternoon or between the evening. So I would say that the first evening would be when the sun passes its apex in the sky, when the sun is directly overhead and begins to go down. That's the first evening. And then the second evening is at dusk when the sun drops below the horizon. I believe that between that period of time, it's permissible to sacrifice the Passover animal. So I know that's different from, what you guys just said. I'm just throwing that out there. That's my understanding.
Yeah, Matthew, that actually, what you just said corroborates with, once again, the Septuagint in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 5, where it says, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, between the evening times is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of this month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. So, why would we even want to, refer to the Septuagint, Matthew?
Well, I believe that the Septuagint was the Old Testament for the early Christians. Like when you examine the quotations in the New Testament of the Old Testament, the majority of the time they're quotations from the Septuagint. I mean, they'll even quote textual variants where the Septuagint would disagree with what's called the Masoretic text. For example, when in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen talks about how many souls came from Jacob Israel's family down to Egypt, he quotes in Acts 7 the number of souls. I believe it's 70 or 75. I get them mixed up. But he quotes to line up with the Septuagint, even though the Septuagint disagrees with the Masoretic text. So I would say that the Septuagint was the Old Testament for the early Christian church, and it's also the oldest complete Old Testament in existence. The Greek Septuagint, beginning around what we would say 250 BC, somewhere right in there. So, and it helps us to get into the mind of ancient Jews, ancient Israelites that lived prior to the time of Messiah. We get into their mind where we see how that sometimes they translated things from the Hebrew. They translated their meaning rather than a literal word for word translation. That's not always the best way to do it, but I think sometimes it helps. And I don't want to go off on a rabbit trail, but I think the Septuagint should be consulted a lot. I have an English translation of the Bible that's based off of the Old Testament, is based off of the Septuagint, and I would put more stock in it than I would the Masoretic text of Scripture.
Yeah, I actually agree with putting stock more so in the Septuagint myself. I don't know where you are at with that, Sean, but it's definitely interesting. It makes you look deeper into what it means between the evenings, plural, right? I mean, there's what would be in between. I guess, as Matthew said, it could be in the afternoon, right?
Well, okay. I'm not discounting anything that was just said. And I do agree with the Septuagint as a translation that was more than likely used by the Hebrews if they didn't have an intact version of scrolls in the Second Temple period that they could go and confer with. They more than likely, 300-400 years leading up to the days of Yeshua and that whole generation, probably had access to a Septuagint. Don't disagree with all the history there and all that there. Can we just focus in on where the definitions of twilight come in, even from a Septuagint standpoint? And I absolutely agree about the afternoon sacrifice. But 3 p.m. being the time of the afternoon sacrifice, the Levites at the temple would slaughter something. And so I was just I'm trying to figure out the reconciliation of that idea as how, if we're claiming that the Masoretic text has a mistranslation and it's using the word twilight, you guys are saying it should be using the word what?
Okay, I think in this case, I think the Masoretic text is correct. I think that some of our English Bibles that use twilight, I think that's an incorrect English rendition from even the Hebrew. The Hebrew is between the evenings, Bein ha-Arabim in Exodus 12:6. And I think some scholars, it's highly debated. Some people believe that the Passover sacrifice was sacrificed at twilight, at that dusky portion between sundown and complete darkness. That's a pretty common belief, especially amongst Church of God adherents, maybe out of Worldwide Church of God, or I think maybe even the Karaites believe that. And then there's another group that believe that Bein ha-Arabim is in reference to what we would call the afternoon period. And I think I'm not as studied on Jubilees as the two of you brothers, but it sounded like one part of that mentioned the third part of the day, like the latter part of the day, towards evening, as the Septuagint says. So, around this time of the year in the spring, 3 p.m. is towards evening. I mean, you would have, at the most 5 hours of daylight left. You'd be in the latter portion of the day, moving into the 15th, which, I agree with Jubilees on that, moving into the 15th when you eat the Passover.
Yeah, well, I'll just read it again real quick, just so we're making sure we're comparing the right ideas. In Jubilees 49:10, it says, "Let the children of Israel come and observe the Passover on the day of its fixed time, on the 14th day of the first month between the evenings, from the third part of the day to the third part of the night. For 2 portions of the day are given to light, and a third part to the evening. And this is what the Lord commanded you, that you observe it between the evenings. It's not permissible to slay it during any period of light, but during the period bordering on the evening, and let them eat it at the time of the evening until the third part of the night."
Yeah, so it can't, if it's an afternoon, there's light, obviously, right? And it's,
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah,
that's what
I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying. It may just be because I don't understand what exactly the author of Jubilees is trying to convey. Right. Part of it sounds like he agrees with my understanding, but then that part that it confuses me, where it says in any portion of the light, but he may not be talking about the last part of the day, because he says the third part of the day to the third part of the night. So that would be from about what we would call 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. roughly. And that's how we've always observed the Passover, in that way, not leaving our houses, or not leaving the house that we keep Passover in until after the biblical definition of midnight, after the actual middle of the night, not 12 p.m. But I would need to study that more in Jubilees. And I'll just on mine, I'll just leave it at that. I think it was an afternoon sacrifice around what we would call 3 p.m. So.
Yeah, and we can move on here, but I just wanted to quickly jump in with something out of Numbers chapter 28, where we see that there's actually more animals to be offered during this feast week, right?
Yeah.
So in my opinion, Matthew, that's likely what we're seeing, when Yeshua was on the cross, essentially, is maybe the sacrificing of these other animals, the 2 bulls from the herd, the 1 ram, and 7 males. You're supposed to do that all throughout the week, on top of the daily sacrifice in and of itself. So I think those are probably different. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it doesn't have to be a big sticking point as far as when they actually sacrifice. We already know that they had a regular practice of sacrificing in the afternoon, and they referred to that as their evening sacrifice. So I'm in agreement with some of the semantic wording of this. And as far as trying to pin it down in a specific hour, I'm not saying that has to be a make or break issue as far as when they actually sacrificed it, whether they waited until literally you couldn't see the sun anymore, because that becomes very subjective, right? If you're living in Judea and the sun goes down over, specific mountaintop, well, it's going to go down a little earlier than if you were just on a flat plain and the sun stayed up till 7:30 at night. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So because in this time of year, the sun, at least where I live, goes down about 7:30 at night. So that's 4.5 hours from 3 in the afternoon to fit into what Jubilees is describing as a third part of the latter part of the day, the third part of the day, which is not considered a part of light, but it's just the evening time. So again, I don't think that has to be a make or break issue. I think a lot of people really struggle with this whole concept of when they actually ate the meal, as far as understanding what Passover, because there's a lot of commentators that will say that Passover had its own day. And so Passover, the 14th, is considered the Passover day. Well, that was just the day you kept the animal until you slaughtered it that day. but then you ate it once it became nighttime, which actually technically you're now into the 15th day, which is the first day of unleavened bread.
Yeah.
And so this is where I see a lot of people really struggle with that idea. And they think that they slaughtered the lamb at evening, and then there was a 24-hour period that's called Passover Day before you got to the first day of unleavened bread. And this is where I think there's a huge misunderstanding for a lot of folks when they're trying to sort through some of the synoptic references of this in the Gospels. And to me, that's just, as long as, I guess we're all in agreement already, regardless of when they slaughtered it, right? Whether it's at 3 p.m. or 7, we believe they ate it at night once it became dark, and they had to eat it before the sun came up the next day. And that was the beginning. Yes, that's the 15th, which is the first day of unleavened bread, which is a high Sabbath, a holy convocation. So I guess we're in agreement about that. It seems like, as far as I can tell.
Yeah,
Okay.
totally, brother.
Yeah.
I love how you put all of that. I mean, there are some groups. I've discussed this with a lot of people. There are a lot of groups that actually believe that the Passover is supposed to be kept at the beginning of the 14th, and they would teach that the Passover animal was sacrificed at twilight, beginning the 14th, and eaten that night only on the 14th, and that the feast doesn't start till the following night. I don't agree with that, and according to what you just explained, and even read in Jubilees, that would not be correct.
Yeah, well, that's what we see in Exodus 12 itself, where it says to keep the animal, till the 14th, and then you're going to wait till the evening time of the 14th, not the evening time of the 13th.
Agreed.
Right?
Agreed.
You're waiting. You've reached the 14th now. Now you wait till the evening time of the 14th to slaughter the animal, and then you're going to eat it once it's dark, meaning you're already into the 15th day. And I think that's really important for people to really grasp and understand as a foundational point coming into this whole conversation. Because when we get to I think it's in Mark 14, or maybe it's Mark 15, you get peculiar phrases that really trip people up. Let me try to go there real quick and see if I can.
Yeah, you tell me which one trips you up, Sean, because like I said, nothing in the Synoptic Gospels leads me to believe that it wasn't Passover. So I know there's a common.
Well, no, I wasn't referring to Passover when I talked about the two verses that tripped me up. I was talking about how many days he's in the ground.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry. No, I've got, to me, I mean, as many times as it mentions it in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, as far as what they call it, the Passover, I have a hard time believing that it's anything but. I think it's like 4 times in Luke, 5 times in Mark, 5 times in Matthew. It's hard for me to think that it's not. And you got, Mark 14:1's account of, 2 days before the Passover, right? And there's little moments like, let me see if I can go to it real quick so that we can read something for the viewer and not just be talking. So it says like Luke 22:1. Now the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. And I know this is one that you referenced earlier, Matthew. And I totally wholeheartedly agree that the Passover itself is interchangeable with unleavened bread. And there's examples of that throughout Scripture where it just says, and this is why I think it's called the Feast of Passover a few times in the Synoptic Gospels. Instead of calling it the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the Meal of Passover, it's just generically lumped as the Feast of Passover, at least from what I could see. But you look in verse 7 of Luke 22, it says, "Then came the first day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed." So to the common person who doesn't understand what we just tried to flesh out for them in Exodus 12, Deuteronomy 16, Numbers 28, you're not going to understand how Feast of Unleavened Bread works. Then you may quickly glaze over the translators inserting into this the word "the first." So that's an italicized word in my translation here, saying that this is not the first literal day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb to be sacrificed. This was the rest of the sentence, in my opinion, gives us the context to understand why the translator would have tried to mistakenly put the word "first" in there. The first day of unleavened bread, they're already eating the Passover, like we just explained. It's a high Sabbath. They're not preparing it. They've already eaten it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, if we're just talking in a colloquial use of the idea, and you are including the 14th as a part of the 7-day festival, technically colloquial just through common expression, making it 8 days, then yes. And this is what some people believe they were doing back then. They were just like lumping the 14th into the 7-day festival that followed and calling the whole thing the Feast of Passover. But I don't know if that's what happening because there's a translator inserted word here.
Yeah, it's hard
So you
because I've seen commentaries, and I don't knock all of them. I think we should refer to commentaries, but not put our full trust in them, obviously. And there's one out of the chronological Gospels by Michael Root. I don't know if you guys have gotten a copy of that or have heard of it, but in it he lines up all the Gospels in various ways that it keeps the timeline going and it's easy to read. And he adds his commentary. And when he comes across this, the Last Supper event, he says that the day, whether it's in Luke, Mark, or it says the first day of unleavened bread, or then came the day of unleavened bread, he believes that the Greek for protos is in reference to the beginning of the preparations for unleavened bread. Now, to me, that's, the more I study this, the more I look into the Greek, I have an issue with that, because when you pull up the Greek itself for protos, that's not there. It's just, it's first, it's chief, and then you have day, hemera, which means day.
Yeah.
So first
And
day of unleavened bread. There's no, it's, in my opinion, it's his own bias towards what he wants to, have his readers understand. And it's the preparations of the unleavened bread. It wasn't actually the first day of unleavened bread. And so
I agree with you, Ken. I'm actually glad you brought up the word protos. That's one of the things I'm going to bring up later when we get to the two verses that are throwing me about the actual days in the grave. But because it uses, there's a superlative form of the word protos that's used in different places in Mark and Luke, that it looks like the translators they come in from a misunderstanding of not realizing that there is no separate day of Passover, and they're not realizing what the preparation day was. And here's something I want to put out here. So I'm hoping we're allowing the viewer to follow us, for one, but since we're now going to get into the actual references in the Gospels about the Feast of Unleavened the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and what Passover is going into it, there is a use throughout the Gospels of John of this idea that the preparation day is always related directly to the day before the weekly Sabbath. So I'm putting forward that that's not accurate at all. That the preparation day being mentioned by John and also in Luke 23:62, Matthew 27:62, is speaking about the first day of unleavened bread, which is what we're told in Exodus 12:14-16. That's the day you get all the leaven out of your house.
yes. Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think
So-
I'm following you. Yeah.
So we've got references in John 19, verse 14, verse 31, and verse 42 that line up with Matthew 27:62. They call it a day of preparation. And this is Exodus 12:15. This is the first day of unleavened bread, where they were required to get all the leaven out of their house. They weren't required
So you think this is simply referring to them preparing to get the leaven out for the following?
Yeah.
They didn't. Okay. So, because I always had an issue with, like, it just kind of flat out tells you in, where is it, Deuteronomy or Leviticus, where it says, and you must remove leaven on that day.
Right.
It doesn't say like when, right at the beginning. Can you do it all throughout the day leading up to what? So that's an interesting perspective. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's Exodus 12:15. It just says the first day of unleavened bread is when you get all the leaven out of your house. So that's not the 14th. That has to be the 15th, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm being quiet because I don't want to sound contradictory.
It's okay. If you've got a good point, that's the whole point of this, brother. If you got a point,
I know. So I believe I'm going to back the truck up a little bit to what Ken said, and I'll use like Mark 14:12 for a reference. So Mark 14:12, I'm reading out of the HCSB, or the KJV says the same thing pretty much. On the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare the Passover so you may eat it?" So if we know the Torah, then we know that the Passover lamb was not sacrificed on the first day of unleavened bread.
That's right. Yeah.
So there has to be something going on here. And I would say that the Greek word protos or proton can be translated before. The word day in Mark 14, verse 12 is italicized. It's not in there. And the word protos is translated before in, for instance, in John 1:15, verse 30, where John says he was before me. That's protos. In Acts 1 verse 1 and Revelation 21:4, it's translated as former. And then in John 15:18, a derivative of protos, proton, is translated as before, where Yeshua said, they hated me before they hated you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's legitimate to translate Mark 14:12 as before the Feast of Unleavened Bread,
Mm-hmm.
when the Passover lamb was slaughtered. And I think that's what's taking place here. I think it's in reference to the 14th day of Abib, because we know that's when the Passover lamb was slaughtered, not the 15th. So I think that protos is legitimate to be translated before there. And I also think Exodus 12:15, where the Hebrew word is rishon, it could be first or chief, but it can also be understood as prior to or before. That is a legitimate understanding of rishon, and it goes back. I'm not saying put your stock in what any one man says, but it does go back as far as the Hebrew commentator Rashi, who commentates on Exodus 12:15 about the word rishon, because they were perplexed. Is the Almighty saying to remove leaven on the 15th? Well, how is that a complete day of unleavened bread then? So some people understood that to be referring to the 14th. My wife and I, we take out some on the 14th and we leave a little bit on the 15th and then take it out on the 15th. That's the way that we do it. We've done that for years because of the discrepancy. So yeah, just throwing that out there. That's my understanding. I didn't get that from Michael Rood's commentary. I got that from studying the Greek text and trying to harmonize the Gospels with the Torah. So, not trying to be contradictory, but that's my view on that.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Doesn't that just for clarification, Matthew, if you're understanding it as saying something like and the day before unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, is that where you're
in Mark 14 verse 12? I think the word day, at least in the KJV, is italicized. The word day is not there. Maybe it's Matthew 26:17. I can't remember. It's one of the two. The word day is not there. So I think that the word,
it's in the Matthew account. Yeah,
it's in the Matthew
But
account.
wouldn't that support the argument that if it's the day before unleavened bread, which we know starts on the evening of the 15th, which is the beginning of the 15th, right?
Right.
Wouldn't that make sense that it's like the day when they sacrificed during the evening leading up to the 15th? So doesn't that support the argument that this is the same day that led to the Last Supper, aka he's having the first, the first unleavened bread day on the 15th with the Passover?
No, I believe this is the beginning of the 14th. I think that the disciples came to Yeshua at the beginning of the 14th and asked him about preparing to eat the Passover. I don't think they fully realized he wasn't going to eat the Passover that year. I think they were asking about, where do we make preparations to eat the Passover? It was the day that the Passover lambs were sacrificed, which was the 14th, but it was before unleavened bread. It definitely wasn't the first day of unleavened bread. They didn't wait till the 15th and just come to him and ask him, hey, where are we going to do the Passover? It would be too late, right? So it has to be the 14th. And I think it's at the beginning of the 14th when they ask him this question.
Okay. That's that verse right there is the one that you and the Matthew 26.
I think it's Matthew 26:17 and Mark 14 verse 12. And then I would couple that with Luke, which you alluded to earlier, Luke 22 verse 15.
Yeah, I've got to upgrade my internet speed. Apparently, I'm struggling with my programs are struggling. Yeah.
But in Luke 22:15, then he said to them, I have fervently desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of the Almighty. So the oldest manuscripts of the New Testament don't use the word again. And this is why you won't see it in like the American Standard Version or Young's Literal or no, maybe not Young's Literal, but the American Standard and Farrar Fenton Bible. It has Yeshua saying, I've desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, but I won't eat it until it's fulfilled in the kingdom.
Yeah,
Well, what
that's something that I did look into as well, Matthew. And you're right. Like, the word again is added in a lot of the translations. It's not there in the Greek.
And the
okay.
Greek word for desire there, if you look at all the times in the New Testament, it refers to a longing that is unfulfilled. It's like when you desire that you want to do something, but you can't. And I've got all the text here, but we don't have to go through all of them. But I would couple that Matthew and Mark understanding with here what Yeshua says in Luke. And there's other reasons too, but I think Yeshua wanted to, but I think he knew that year he was going to have to die, and they were preparing for it. The disciples were preparing for the Passover. They thought in their minds, "Hey, we're going to eat it with the Master." They'd likely been eating it with him, years prior to this. But I don't think that they got to that year.
Well, let me jump in real quick. I'm sure there's a lot of viewers out there that are probably, they're probably asking the question, and they're probably wanting one of us to ask the question about what you just explained from Luke 22, verses 14 to 17. Where do you see the disconnect from the previous verses 7 through 13 when it introduces this idea and Yeshua commands the disciples to go and prepare the Passover? They get to the house he told them they were going to go to. He says, I come to eat the Passover with my disciples in verse 11. And then verse 13, he says, and they prepared the Passover. Everything was just as he had told them it was going to be. And then verse 14 flows right into when the hour had come, they reclined at the table and the apostles with them. So you're suggesting that in verse 7 through 13, he told his disciples to go prepare this meal, this Passover meal. They went to do that, yet this is still the day beforehand. And then
Yes.
verse 14 is the day beforehand. They're eating a separate meal, which isn't the Passover. But okay. So
And in
that's
verse 15 too, and he said to them, I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you. It sounds like it's sitting right there in front of them, right? After they had already gone and got in the room and prepared it all, type thing.
Yeah, I'll say this is what I say. I understand how somebody can read Matthew, Mark, and Luke and come to the conclusion that Yeshua ate the Passover. There's some technicalities on the word like prepare or eat, that I could point out. My main reasons for not believing this is the Passover is that I think that the evidence in the Gospel of John outweighs the evidence in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's other reasons from Exodus 12, we may get into later. But yes, what you explained, Sean, that is exactly what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting that. I'm
okay.
also granting that I understand what you're saying,
Sure.
and I see how you come to that conclusion. I'm
sure someone's asked you that before. I'm sure you've run into that before.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what, if you're willing, what type of evidence in John do you see that gives you that weight?
We can start with John 13. John 13 verses 1 through 4.
Okay.
Let's
start there real quick.
Where it refers to the meal that Yeshua and his disciples are having as before the feast of the Passover.
Okay.
Doesn't refer to it as the Passover, references to before. There are no women and children at the meal. They've got their shoes off to wash their feet instead of their shoes on, which the commandment was to have their shoes on their feet. That's in John. In John 18, verse 28.
So I'm sorry, let me slow you down a little bit because we want the viewer to be able to follow a little bit if possible. Okay. So you said, okay, so we want to start with verses 1 through 4 if we can. Sure. So you're saying that because the Feast of Passover, it is mentioned in verse 1.
And it says before the Passover festival.
Before the Feast of Passover. Well, this is actually one of those where I was talking about earlier, where it could be a reference to the entire feast itself, because it's saying not the meal of Passover, but the Feast of Passover. That's neither here nor there, either way. But Jesus, knowing his hour had come, he would depart out of this world of the Father, having loved his own who were in the world. He loved them to the end. And during supper, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. And so at this point, he gets up from supper, lays aside his garment, takes a towel, and starts washing feet. And you're saying that that this isn't just a summary statement and an intro into the time period that we're at in verse 1, moving into the supper in verse 2, but that this is all within the same moment. Like verse 1 and verse 2, there is no, verse 1's not an introductory statement, but of technical detail, but because you're just saying it's basically saying this is just days before the feast of Passover began at all.
I think 13:1 is referencing the night that they're having the supper.
Okay.
I think it's calling it before the Passover. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And
Yeah.
so do you see a break from 13 through 17 to the point of the crucifixion? Do you see a break of time where it would give us an indicator that there was but you don't, though, because of course that's what you were telling us, is that you think he was actually arrested the beginning of the 14th,
Yes.
which is okay.
Right. Yeah. And I think John 13 through 17 was all words that Yeshua spoke that night at the supper.
Okay.
Yeah,
I do too, by the way. That was one of my fun revelations in doing this study. I thought that was amazing because so many times people think that there was so little conversation had, some tension with Judas and all that, but really, like, there's a huge bulk of conversation and teaching and instruction before he leaves.
Yeah, it's a massive discussion going on there in John. I love it too. I'm just gonna throw something in real quick, guys. Where you had talked about Judas Iscariot going to betray him in John 13, verse was it 2? That led me to reconsider Matthew 26, verse 5, where it says that they said not during the feast. So they didn't want to, because they didn't want to create an uproar, right? A tumult of people. So even it seems like they wanted to do it before any of the feasts started, which makes sense. So because I'm not in the middle, I'm still towards believing it was the Passover. That makes logical sense to me to not do that, right? Because a lot of these people believed that he was the Messiah, and often when they would disagree with him, they were scared of the people, right? A lot of the people, like I said, they thought that he was truly a great prophet to be heard. And so it's interesting that how they're kind of conspiring to take care of him before the feast. And if that's what actually happened when they made an agreement with Judas to go have this little meal, if it isn't Passover, to do it before, isolate him, or at least, they're going to Gethsemane, Judas takes off and comes back with a band of men in an isolated area away from everybody and then removes him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that leads credence to your argument, Matthew. I could be wrong, but I don't know what to do with that. It could just be that they said they wanted to do that and didn't do it. But I don't know.
Yeah, that would eventually be one of my points. Along with, if we keep reading in John 13, I don't want to skip ahead, but it goes along with the Judas thing, is that when Yeshua told Judas, "What thou doest quickly," it says the disciples thought that he was telling him to go buy something for the feast on Passover night. That doesn't make sense to me that they would even think that Yeshua is saying, you need to go buy something. It's Passover night. You need to go buy something for the feast. Remember, this is Hebrew culture. Everything's shut down. If it's the 15th, it's a high Sabbath. It's a high day.
I've heard people talking about how they were basically using your argument, Matthew, to say that the time in the evening where they would be reclining at the table in this moment, John 13, was not yet dark. And that's why he would tell them to do it quickly, given the impression of the other disciples that he had to run out quickly, go get something and come back, since he was the one that kept the money, because it was not yet technically dark. And so they were at the meal reclining and doing his thing, but they had not actually started eating the food yet because it wasn't dark yet. Just a thought. A thought. And I know it's hard. It's just, these are just kind of conjectured things that are thrown in there. Because when you're studying all sides of this, you're like, man, because that is a great point that you're making about him going out to buy something. And that would absolutely be a no matter what level of understanding you seem to have as a disciple of Yeshua. That seems to be a big no to instruct someone to do, much less to go out and perform on a high Sabbath. And so, I was just trying to look up different arguments for different rebuttals.
Yeah, that's a good one, John. That's a good argument, because I honestly, I wasn't sure exactly how to approach that in light of our stance. But Matthew, what do you use the argument about the bread, how it's, the whole artos versus azumos? Do you use that at all in your argument, or is that one that you feel isn't very necessary because it could just be context driven? They didn't need to add that extra bit of.
Yeah, I think it's not conclusive. I think it'd be worth maybe mentioning if you get to the latter part of the discussion, but it's not conclusive. Artos is equivalent to our English word bread, and both artos and the English word bread can refer to unleavened bread. There's another word for unleavened bread that would remove all doubt, but we can't say that artos never means unleavened bread, because we have especially one instance in Luke 24 where it has to mean unleavened bread on the road to Emmaus, where Yeshua broke bread with the men there.
Yeah,
I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I also found out that Septuagint uses the word artos when speaking about the showbread in the tabernacle, both in Exodus and Leviticus.
Oh, really? Yeah.
It's not. We know 100% know that it's talking about unleavened bread, but it's just using the generic word because it's already giving you that foundational context to know what it'd be talking about. So that's, I kind of always thought that argument was interesting, but this is what we're always talking about, context creates comprehension, right? We're looking at this is why it's not beyond a translator to mess up with the word and not be specific or precise, or even to use his own misunderstanding of the Old Testament when he's translating things in the New Testament. Yeah. And we see that all the time as far as their assumptions that they put into the text. So
quick comment on the common rebuttal to the disciples thinking Yeshua told them to go buy something for the feast is that they hadn't started eating. But if you follow John 13, the whispering to Judas takes place after supper and after foot washing. So they've already eaten, they've already washed feet, and it's not until verse 21 through 29 where we get to the whisper to Judas. So that is my comment to the rebuttal, just to lay that out there. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Sean, did you want to do your little timeline thing real quick? Before we get into we've just been jumping around all over the place. It's hard to keep steady on one thing because there's so many things to discuss. But did you want to do that, Sean?
Yeah, there's a lot of points to discuss. Just give me 1 second. Let me see if I'm going to be able to screen share with safety. And then we'll this is why we don't normally do live broadcasts, right? Yeah. Because you can't screen share. So you can, but you just run the risk of somebody trying to hack your screen share. Okay, it looks like it's going to let me tonight, so that's good. All right, and so can you guys see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right. So I've made this little graph, right, from the things I was trying to put together, and it looks like can you see the actual graph well, or is it? I wonder how it's showing up on the live stream. I'm gonna look real quick. May need to enlarge it for folks.
It looked well on my screen.
Okay, and I may need to. It looks like the live stream's behind us a little bit.
Yeah, it's good where you're at there, buddy.
Well, I need to make sure that I'm presenting. I'm locked on presentation for people. Present to everyone, so that when you guys talk, it doesn't change back to you. All right. Still, man, the live stream's way behind.
Wow.
Okay. So let's see here. All right.
Sean, while you're doing that, I'll just bring something up. Or do you need me to not talk?
No, it's good. It's okay. Can you guys see it?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So it looks like what I've got here is this idea of, we all agree that the day begins at sunset leading into the nighttime, right? And this idea is we've got a day of preparation, because from what I've read anyway, is that the Passover lamb was killed at twilight, and this would lead us in what we call a sunset area. And without getting into the particulars of that, which we've already covered, I've got, listed out with Exodus 12, 6 through 8, Deuteronomy 16, 1 through 4, Jubilees 49, 12, Matthew 26, 19, Luke 22, and Mark 14, 16. That just as and that's not, those aren't contentious points. These are just in case people doesn't know and they want to actually reference these later. So I've got this idea that I'm going to blow this up a little bit for folks if possible. All right. So we've got this idea that the Passover lamb was to be killed at sunset. And I know regardless of some of the points that we just went over in John 13, that this would have been, whether it was a misunderstanding of what the disciples thought Jesus was sent out to do, because that was an insertion by John saying, well, the disciples thought he was saying and talking about this, but that technically wasn't what was happening anyway. So it's interesting. But given the idea that the Passover was what they were eating, because of how many times it says, let's prepare the Passover, they ate the Passover, they were having the Passover. That's the basic premise that I went off of right here to show on day, which would be a Tuesday, what we would generically call a Tuesday. And I'm hoping that Ken and Matt, can you guys see this very well?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then you've got a full day to the next sunset, which would have been the first day of unleavened bread, which would have been the 15th, the preparation day. And in that time period, while they're eating the Passover meal, you've got this John 13 through 17 happening. You've got Matthew 26, 20, Mark 14, 18, Luke 22, 14, and John 13, 2. These ideas of them actually eating the Passover meal. And then you've got, after the Passover's over, it's still nighttime. I put around midnight. I was just guessing. They went to the Mount of Olives after dinner. And that's where we got all these 4 verses that line up with that basic timeline of where they went to the Mount of Olives. And then I didn't include the arresting part because, and all that, and them going to the Praetorium and going to Pilate and Herod and all that stuff, simply because I didn't have enough space in my timeline chart. But I also I tried to skip ahead to the 3rd hour, which Mark 15:25 says this was the moment he was crucified. And then in the 9th hour, he's actually, he dies, he gives up his last breath. And then shortly after that, which it's not directly stated, Joseph of Arimathea buries Jesus in his tomb, and the 2 Marys go home to prepare spices for the body and rest for the rest of that Sabbath day, which would, like I said before, if they're getting the leaven out, that is absolutely a preparation day. If that was the day they're instructed to do something as a preparatory thing, even though it is a Sabbath, they're asking, and it's not really, it doesn't take much effort, to be honest with you, to just throw stuff out of your house, you know what I mean? And it doesn't take too long, in my opinion, especially when you understand what the true leaven was. And it's not just anything that has yeast in it, but it was the leavening lump that they would use to leaven things with. It would take less than 10 minutes to clean the leaven out of your house. But the point is, do you have this prep day that they would consider the preparation and a high Sabbath, which is what I feel John is calling it in its specific moments, where on, John 19 verses, 31, 42, those different passages, which is why he wanted to bring this body off the cross, because it was the Sabbath day that day. So he's dying on a Sabbath day. The 2 Marys, they see where he's laid, so then they go back home to prepare their spices. That takes 2 days for them to prepare their spices, but we'll get back to that in a minute. And then I've got this moment here on the Thursday, which is actually day 1 of Yeshua being in the grave. I put the priests and the Pharisees asked the guards to be guards at Jesus's tomb in Matthew 27:62. So from that, we're getting, they were supposed to be stationed there for 3 days. Or at least until the 3rd day, so to make sure that he doesn't rise or there's disciples come and steal the body. And so that's day 1 that this is happening, because it says that the day after the preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees came to Pilate and asked for his body, or asked for guarding his body at the tomb. So then that's put us into day 2. Nothing's really happening. Day 3 is the actual day of, and if you can see this at all here, this is the day he would rise, but this is also the day, the moment of the walk to Emmaus as well, that whole conversation, because it says he came back to their house, or he got to their place at evening and reclined with them, but then disappeared after he broke bread. And so these timelines here are happening. The majority of the things that we're reading about are actually, from what I could understand, are happening on the preparation day, which is the first day of unleavened bread, the high Sabbath, as mentioned in these verses I've got down here at the bottom of the timeline chart. And then the weekly Sabbath would be the actual 3rd day when he rises. That way he's actually rising on a Sabbath, which is wonderfully paralleling the future, right, in the day of the Lord to come. In addition to that, we have the 2 Marys showing up at the tomb early at the beginning of the week at the dawn, which would be when the sun starts to break on the actual Sunday, because it's already had about 12 hours after the completion of the day that he's already risen, you've got about 12 hours, and you've got they finally, and that's why it says that Mary showed up after the Sabbath was over. Mary's came back to the tomb with the spices, and they saw the angel. The stone was rolled away. I'm guessing the guards were like dead men, knocked out or something at that point when they showed up. But it's kind of hard to tell from the language as far as what the guards were doing at that moment. Were they knocked out, or were they already running back to tell their
Oh, yeah, they're
officers?
gone. They're
Yeah,
hightailing.
it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to say exactly if they'd woken up yet or not, but or if they came back alive, because it just says they were like dead men laying there. But I'm not sure
Well, yeah,
exactly
they
what.
did come back, because then they went to the Pharisees and said, "Hey, like,"
Right, right.
and then the
Yeah,
Pharisees
yeah,
were trying to get him to lie about it. Right?
exactly. I'm not saying they were unconscious for a long period of time. I'm just saying
Yeah.
the moment that Mary's talking to the angel and how those moments line up in Matthew 28:1-4, Mark 16:1, and Luke 24:1. That whole time period there of whatever's going on when the angel's actually sitting there talking to the Marys, and I don't know if the guards had already seen previously the stone roll away, and then they ran back to tell the superiors, or all this is kind of happening at the same moment the Marys arrive. So it's kind of a little ambiguous, a little vague from what I could research and find. But ultimately, that puts us in an overall timeline of the first day is preparation day. That's the day he would have died on the cross, and he's in the grave a full 3 days.
Yeah, that's awesome, Sean.
I know there's some
clincher,
holes.
yeah, the clincher, John 19:31. I mean, where it says, "For that Sabbath was a high day," we know that is the first day of unleavened bread. That would have started the evening before, right? And
Right.
last until the following evening. So, what do you think about that one there, Matthew?
Well, I appreciate, as all this work in the chart. As I said at the beginning, I don't believe that Yeshua was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. So, as far as John 19:31 goes, I agree with you that Sabbath day, and I think that's a reference to weekly Sabbath, was a high day, megas in the Greek. I think the reason it was high, or megas, big, is because it wasn't just a weekly Sabbath; it was also the first day of unleavened bread. So I believe that Yeshua died on the 14th day of Abib. He was put in the tomb prior to the Sabbath, and the women went home, prepared spices and ointments, and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. And then I believe he rose on the first day of the week as the antitype of the wave sheaf offering, which was lifted up by the priest on the morrow after the Sabbath. I do think he rose during the night portion of the first day of the week, because when the women came early in the morning on the first day of the week, while it was yet dark, he was already gone. So I think that when we read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that we have a preparation Sabbath first day sequence of his death and resurrection. But I mean, we'd have to go through each one of the Gospels and see where it's talking about preparation day. Like, I think it's in Mark, maybe Mark 15, where the author says it was preparation day, comma, the day before the Sabbath, as though that was just commonly known. Like, hey, it's prep day. This is the day before the Sabbath.
This is where it's going to be fun, Matthew, because that's the sticking point. Mark 15:42, and that's
Right.
the use of the word protos in a superlative form, where I actually would agree with you as far as the actual Greek use of the word protos, because of the way it's used in that particular passage, because they actually try to use it prosabaton. But the word protos, as we, if you look that up in the Strongs and you look into the exhaustive meanings of it does mean chief, it does mean first, but then there is other translations where it's used the word before.
Sure.
And then Mark 15:42 is the only use of the word prosabaton as being before the Sabbath day in all the scriptures.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder if, because the word prote or protos, which is also just shortened to pro in the use of Mark 15:42 to say before the Sabbath, it makes me wonder if it's actually trying to say the chief Sabbath or the high day Sabbath, because that is also the use, a translation of the word protos.
Yeah. No, I get your point, and I believe it was the 15th. I believe it was the high day. I think the reason it was high is because of my understanding of weekly Sabbath, and I don't want to get off into a rabbit trail on that, but I believe a high day is when a weekly Sabbath and an annual Sabbath hit on the same day. I think that's what makes it high or big, megas in the Greek. So my point is that I think the author here is saying because it was preparation day, and then he explains it, that is the day before the Sabbath. In other words, everybody knows this.
Well,
Everybody knows that the day before Sabbath is called preparation day.
well, it is traditionally, but this is what I was trying to put forward at the very beginning of there is preparation instructed on the first day of unleavened bread. And that would be a conflict as far as saying it's the sixth day of the week as a prep before the weekly Sabbath, or the actual prep before the first holy convocation of unleavened bread. And so that's where I was just trying to put forward the idea that to me, that seems to be the common misunderstanding. All the commentary I could find about this, even dating back to supposedly the 4th century, people still talking about this conversation. None of them seem to acknowledge the actual preparations instructed in Exodus 12 for the first day of unleavened bread. And I'm baffled. I'm baffled by that, because that is considered a prep day, is a day you would do something. And if it is the high Sabbath at the same time, to me, it just helped me make 100% sense of all these references in the book of John, as far as what Joseph of Arimathea is doing with the body. And it's okay if we disagree. That's kind of why we're doing this show, right? And so I personally, when I run into Mark 15:42, and I think it's also in Luke 23:56, I see this idea of, wait a minute, how are they using this word protos? And specifically, is this a translator issue where he didn't understand what the preparation day was, so therefore he just assumed it was the Friday before the weekly Sabbath, and therefore that's why you've got one word in the Greek, but you got 5 words being translated in English, because he's giving his explanation as he understands it from as a translator. And this is something that Ken and I have run into multiple times as we study the scriptures, is to translate something almost requires a decent understanding of scripture itself, so you can understand some, otherwise you're going to translate it poorly. And which is why I think we're so blessed in this modern generation to have all these lexicons and concordances and various translations at our disposal to look at, and to see how they get in these different manuscripts that are rediscovered, and we get all these cross-referencing. And I think it's such a wonderful blessing. Like tonight, Matthew, you've shown some things in the Septuagint I wasn't aware of. That's awesome. So I need to go look up some things. And then I just think we're in a blessed era to be able to even have these discussions, and not just have some priest come in and say, all you guys are wrong. This is what it says, and this is what it means. Take it or leave it. If you don't agree with me, you're heretical, and you're kicked out of the church and disfellowship. Sure. Like, that's what they had to deal with 500-600 years ago, or even way back into the 3rd and 4th century. If they couldn't compare and contrast different ideas to try to see, wait a minute, the way you're presenting John doesn't quite match the way I think Matthew's talking. So who's right? Well, the priest would just come in and say, I'm right. And if you don't believe me, get out of the church. And that's the sad part, So thankfully we can actually have these discussions.
Yeah, I didn't jump one ship of tradition in order to swim over to another ship of tradition, So that's why I do appreciate you guys having these discussions, and your knowledge base. I mean, it's awesome. I've learned a couple things tonight. Sean, I'm gonna look more into that day of preparation as it pertains to the first day of unleavened bread, and it being the entire day like that. Yeah, that's really interesting to me. That's one that I honestly struggled with. I didn't know what to do with that, so that's awesome. But I want your opinions, both of you guys, on, if we've got the time, on all 4 gospels that talk about the first day of the week when Mary Magdalene goes down. The word there for week is sabbaton. It's used everywhere for Sabbath, but for whatever reason, it's translated as week in all 4 of the Gospels there. So I'm just wondering, is there something there that we're missing there, or can the translators use that? Can they somehow make the Sabbath day, the Greek sabbaton, mean the English day, or the English word day, or week rather? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure. I've seen people talk about it, how they just use generically for an entire week, since the Sabbath is supposed to incorporate 7 days. It's the 7th of 7 days. So
yeah, because we're supposed to count 7 Sabbaths to leading up to the next, Shavuot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the word sabbaton can mean either Sabbath or the interval between 2 Sabbaths, depending on the context in which it is used. The best example for the interval between two Sabbaths or for a whole week would be in Luke 18, where the Pharisee says, I fast twice in the week. And that's the word Sabbaton. And I don't think he's saying I fast twice on the Sabbath day. That doesn't make sense. I don't think he's saying I fast twice in the Sabbaths leading to Pentecost. That's only 2 times in a large span of days. That's not much fasting. I think it's using the word Sabbaton as the interval between 2 Sabbaths. And the way they would count would be 1 to the Sabbath, 2 to the Sabbath, 3 to the Sabbath. And so Sabbaton could be used there in the Greek New Testament and also other Greek literature historically for the interval between 2 Sabbaths. So I think that the women came to the tomb early in the morning on the first day of the week. John's gospel says while it was yet dark, so it was in that twilight period, that dusky period before sunrise. And Yeshua had already risen. I do think he rose on the first day of the week, but I think he rose during the nighttime portion. And I think it was antitypical, as I think when Paul says that he's the first fruits of them that sleep, I think Paul is reminiscing of the barley harvest, the wave sheaf, the barley harvest in 1 Corinthians 15, that the priest would lift up and wave before the presence of the Heavenly Father. And I think Yeshua, antitypical of that, rose on the day after the Sabbath on the first day of the week as the first fruits of those who had fallen asleep.
Awesome. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So, Sean, if I can just bring up one more scripture. I don't know how much more time we've got here, but
sure, brother, go ahead.
Yeah, just in John chapter 18, verse 28, where it says, Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So what is that saying? First of all, Sean, as you and I have studied the scriptures for the last few years together, we're noticing that it appears that there seem to be some unwritten instructions. Well, they're written down now, called the Talmud. They're in the rabbinic oral writings, but it seems like we're running against some of these rabbinic traditions and some of these things. And in my opinion, we might be seeing one here where it talks about where but they wanted to eat the Passover and they didn't want to go into the praetorium because they didn't want to get defiled. First of all, how would that defile them going into the praetorium?
Yeah, that's something that I've wondered too, because I mean, it's to me it looks like the praetorium. I mean, was this also the place where they whipped Yeshua in the praetorium?
I don't know if it says that.
I don't think so. I think he was out in the courtyard or something, right? So
Yeah.
if I'm not misunderstanding about the praetorium itself, but it seems like this wasn't a place where there would just be random dead bodies they could come across or be around, or anything that might resemble some sort of tomb. So they're not defiling themselves there. And this, of course, goes into the conversation of, is this in the middle of the night? Is this early morning? Like, is this past 3 a.m. or is this, what, has the sun risen yet? Are they talking about eating the Passover that night, the meal? They still haven't eaten the meal yet, or they just don't want to be defiled because they haven't eaten it for the following day? Because this is one that I feel like weighs in on the idea that they were having the Passover that night, because if it's the middle of the night and the guys that are escorting the chief priests and the Pharisees are escorting Jesus to the Roman authorities, and they don't want to enter this place because they haven't eaten the Passover yet, well, that would be like a no-brainer if the Passover wasn't even going to be slaughtered till later in that day, 12 to 15 hours later, and then eaten at twilight 18 to 21 hours later, right? That would be a no-brainer that they haven't eaten it yet, because it's technically, it's not the slaughtering day yet, right? So I think I'm trying to address an argument, and I know that neither one of you have said that this is okay. I don't want to misrepresent your arguments. Let me try this one more time.
I actually did some research into this because this was one of the sticking points for me. So
okay,
I'll just read it real quick, Sean, and then you can kind of address it if you want. And this is actually out of some commentary in the Aramaic English New Testament by Roth's version. And he says that this may actually be something that we could find in the Mishnah. So he says, as the Mishnah details in Pesachim chapter 6, verse 4. So this is a rabbinic writing for those who are watching who may not know what I'm referring to. It's one of the oral traditions writings. And it says a festal offering called a chagiga, I probably totally butchered that, but derives from the flock of the sheep or the herd of oxen, from lambs or from goats, from males or from females. And it is eaten for 2 days and the intervening night to the night of the 15th of Nisan. The second night's eating then of what is called the chagiga, or obligatory burnt offering that Pharisees must consume, is the pascha, the Passover, that they are afraid they will not be able to eat if they are defiled. So it seems like they kept a second one for themselves the following day, these Pharisees, as kind of like an elite type of thing, that they didn't want to be defiled, to not eat that one. Because if the Passover had already happened and the night before, they, for whatever reason, if this is, legitimate, and this is an appropriate quote out of this Mishnah writing, then I guess they had a second Passover meal the next day that they didn't want to be defiling themselves for. So, I mean, it would be appropriate, because we know that Talmudic Judaism is so rife with so many extra traditions and so many things, right?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm following what you just read, because I didn't get to read it myself. I was trying to listen, so I apologize if I may have missed a word or two. So, you just read a rabbinic tradition stating that the Pharisees ate 2 different Passovers on 2 different days. Is that what you said?
So it would have been, so it would have been the night that Yeshua had the Passover meal, the Last Supper, and then the following night they didn't. So during that day, they went into the praetorium. They didn't want to go in because they didn't want to defile themselves leading up to their second Passover, or their second Passover meal, apparently.
So they had you're saying that someone claims they had a Passover meal both on the night of the 14th leading to the 15th, and also on the 15th leading to the 16th?
That's what they're saying is what the Mishnah, and the book's called Pesachim. So it's all about Passovers. There's like a huge thing about Passovers in chapter 6, verse 4. It talks about that in that book, that the Pharisees did that, and they didn't want to defile themselves according to their traditions of defiling, in my opinion, not God's commandments of defilement. And so that they could have their own specific elite kind of Pharisaic Passover dinner, which is
Okay.
interesting. I don't know if I haven't fully been able to vet that, but it makes sense to me.
So, okay. Well, that could be a possibility. I'm just trying to process what you're saying. I've never heard that before.
Yeah,
and that
neither have I until I looked into it.
Yeah, that's kind of a. But why do you think the text says that they had not eaten the Passover yet? If they'd already eaten one previously, and why wouldn't it say they hadn't eaten their second one?
That's a good question.
I don't know. It's interesting, man. But I don't put it past the Pharisees to make up some random tradition, because they clearly had plenty of that, right? I mean, They were doing that everywhere they went, and regardless of the actual text, they would just make stuff up and just do it, So, yeah, I mean, it's a possibility, man. Interesting. So, Matthew, overall, if I could summarize it, the most accurately to represent what you've been trying to say tonight, is you think that they basically, that from the verses that you pointed out earlier in John and also in Mark, that there was a meal had a day before the actual evening of the 14th, which would have been the evening of the 13th. Is that right?
Evening of 13th, moving into the 14th. I mean, it would have been on the 14th, but yes, moving out of the 13th. I think that was the Last Supper. I think it was a preparatory meal. And that's how I understand, where will we go prepare the Passover? I think Yeshua wanted to eat Passover with his disciples, but he wouldn't be able to, because that year he would be slaughtered the next day on the 14th.
Okay. And so then, therefore, if I could carry this through here,
sure.
And therefore you're saying that once we get into the 14th,
right,
and they would do their afternoon/evening sacrifices that we've been talking about. Afternoon is a word that we use in English, but when they would do their evening sacrifices around 3 p.m. ish, that's
right.
Yeshua dies on the cross, according to what you've understood from this, and that is still the 14th.
Yes,
and therefore this makes sense for you when we see these words, preparation day,
right?
But you actually linked that, not just the preparation day going into the high Sabbath of the 15th, but also Did you say it was also a preparation day from your understanding into a weekly Sabbath?
Yes, I believe that's why it's called a high day. It's never termed a high Sabbath. It is termed a high day. It says that Sabbath day was a high day. I think the reason it was high or big, megas in the Greek, is because it wasn't only the weekly Sabbath, it was also the first day of unleavened bread. So yeah, I think Yeshua was crucified prior to that. And then, like when the women prepared spices and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment at the end of Luke 23, I think it was reference to the weekly Sabbath, but it was also the first day of unleavened bread, which, that makes it a high day.
So therefore, it puts you in the camp of saying, as you've already admitted at the very beginning of this broadcast, that you don't think he was in the earth 3 days and 3 nights. So then that's where my next question would come from: is what do you feel that the scriptures? Clearly, you don't feel the scriptures tell us that he was actually going to be directly in the earth 3 days and 3 nights. So what do you think that Jesus was referring to when he said he would? The sign of Jonah. He referenced the sign of Jonah, who's in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. So will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights?
I don't believe that heart of the earth means grave in Matthew 12:40. When I study the Gospels, that's the only verse. I think everything else harmonizes with a 6-day Sabbath, first day sequence. I think Matthew 12:40 is the only verse that it appears on the surface to be out of kilter. But I would interpret heart of the earth, which is an idiomatic phrase anyhow. The Greek word there is not for grave,
Right.
it's heart of the earth. I think it is a reference to Jerusalem. I think that the Hebrew people considered Jerusalem to be the midst or the center of the earth. And from the time that he was removed, so to speak, from the protection of the Father and given into the hands of sinful men there in Jerusalem to experience the betrayal and the scourging and the death and in the tomb and in the resurrection, I think that encompasses a 3-day and night period, just the time of his death and resurrection. And I've written, if it's okay to say this, I've got a study that I've written called The Sign of Jonah. I wrote it back in 2003, and I think the last time I updated it was 2013. And I go over my view in detail. And then at the end, there's a chapter on Matthew 12, verse 40, which is the sign of Jonah chapter. So I believe the sign of Jonah. I just don't think that Yeshua is saying I'm going to be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. I think heart of the earth references the city of Jerusalem.
Matthew, does that study include, by any chance, Jonah dying and going to Sheol for 3 days?
I believe that Jonah did die in the belly of the whale.
Yeah, and his soul would have gone to Sheol.
Yeah, I think the word Sheol is even referenced in Jonah chapter 2, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's something that Ken and I have come across that we both kind of feel is something a lot of people miss, is Yeshua referencing the sign of Jonah not being the burying part, but the resurrection part. And that Jonah was resurrected after being spit out of the well, which would give him the credence and the people of Nineveh to actually believe his message, because they just saw something crazy happen. And that's where, and I'm just wondering, so does your study on that conclude that the sign itself was the resurrection, or was it, how do you compare Jonah and Yeshua's words in that regard?
Let me read something here that I wrote down for this thing. I'll just read it. And it'll come out better than me trying to remember it.
Okay, go ahead, brother.
I put, as Jonah was thrown overboard into the sea, so Christ was betrayed, delivered into the hands of sinful men. Luke 24:7. Delivered unto the Gentiles. Luke 18:32. Rejected, abandoned, forsaken of God. I list a bunch of scriptures. As Jonah was swallowed by the great fish, so Christ was swallowed by the evil which surrounded him. To the mob near the garden, Yeshua said, this is your hour and the power of darkness. Behold, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. The hour begins with the kiss of Judas. From the kiss of Judas on what we would call Thursday to the earthquake just before dawn on Sunday, 3 days and 3 nights without the protection of his Father, left in the heart of the earth. And you'll notice that if you read the texts, let's see, I'm trying to find it here in my notes, where Yeshua mentions, I'll be betrayed into the hands of sinful men, and I'll be scourged, and I'll be put to death. He always mentions, I'm going to go to Jerusalem for this to take place. And there's so many texts in Scripture where Jerusalem was considered to be the center of the earth or the heart of the earth by the Hebrew people. It's where, like in Acts 2 on the day of Pentecost, people come from all over the known world, the inhabited earth, to where? Jerusalem, the midst of the earth. So I think that the death is definitely included in the time period of the 3 days and 3 nights. I just don't think that it is exclusively in reference to the death. Hopefully that kind of clarified my position on that a little bit.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's what I was referencing earlier, Ken, when I was talking about some of my questioning on the Greek translations, as far as what seem to be contradictions. I guess really my whole premise so far just lies on, and there's some things that Matthew's brought up tonight that I do want to look into, but my initial premise in this study lies just simply upon the idea that that the frames of reference for this meal that they're having that night, being a Passover, lining up with some of the events that take place on that preparation day, that which would have been the next day, from my understanding of Exodus 12, of the actual feast of unleavened bread itself, and then leading into some of the sequence of events that followed, so that the Marius can show up at the first of the week and see that he's already resurrected and the tomb's already just empty, which is why the angel has to basically tell them that and show them by rolling away the stone. And so therefore that of course does go off the premise that I'm taking a different approach to Matthew 12:40 than Matthew is. And I'm taking this approach that was a much more literal reference as far as why Jonah was dead and resurrected 3 days and 3 nights. So will Yeshua be. And I guess that's definitely the traditional mindset, but I'm open to looking at, further details. So that's why I wanted to have this conversation.
Yeah.
Sure. I would appreciate, I mean, it's not like you got to do it tonight, but I would appreciate, I can send both of you my study, the Sign of Jonah study, and then you can just take your time with it, take your time with it and go through it and say, hey, I disagree here, or I agree here. And if you end up disagreeing at the end, it'll be fine. But the study will give detailed reasoning for why I take the position that I do. And so I would love to send that to you, brothers, and get your input on it in the future.
Yeah, cool, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Just shoot it over. We'll take a look at it. And because the little timeline that I put together recently, maybe I can find a good place to correct some things, or maybe I just throw it away because it's all nonsense. So, but either way, because because I put together a timeline doesn't mean that I'm set hard and fast on it. I just trying to help my mind organize all the details that are put together.
Yeah,
that's how I work too. I need to have a visual of something with all my thoughts and stuff just gathered there, so I can see what I'm doing.
Yeah.
But have you guys considered anything in John chapter 6 where it talks about the Passover happening then, and then it says after that on the next day, and then he's essentially given us the metaphor of his body and the blood and all that stuff, which you guys know what I'm talking about there, where he says, you need to drink my blood and eat my flesh. And then he kind of takes that metaphor over to the Last Supper, where he's like, this is my blood, this is my body. That's on a Sabbath. That's on a Passover in John 6, in my opinion.
I definitely believe it's a metaphor for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's a metaphor.
I'm just wondering about the timing though, where he's doing that. It seems like he did it in an open, general, public area then during Passover, and then he does it again at the Last Supper there for Passover.
Yeah,
that's a very interesting point, Ken. I've never hooked that up, so that's something I could look at.
But yeah, I've learned quite a bit of stuff tonight, guys. It's like I said, I'm not militant on my position right now. I know that, as you guys have probably had happen in your lives, when you think you're right about something, you get some more information that's been kind of under the surface for a while. So it's humbling, and I really enjoy these discussions. And Matthew, I'm really thankful that you were willing to discuss your perspective. I'm still 70-30, brother. But
that's good. It's fine.
Yeah, I think for me, I probably I probably, I don't know. Maybe I'm 90-10 at this point. I don't know. So I
Oh,
definitely know I've got some things to look at, and I think that I think that there's just so many details you have to kind of consider all at once. And like you said, Matthew, there is like I quickly started to see, Matthew, what you've been talking about at several points tonight, which was really digging into the origins of the words and how they can be translated and what's going on. And I know that when you try to bring up that concept with people and other topics, they're like, well, you're no Hebrew or Greek scholar. You're like, but I understand that. But the reason why I would even suggest that is because if you find something that's utterly contradictory to something that's already been laid down in the Old Testament, that's plain wording, you know what I mean? And this is kind of where I my hermeneutic approach is this idea of I have to look at the context that's given before us before I get to circumstantial details that may seem to contradict something later in later books. So if I have a solid foundation, usually you can weed out biased errors or even mistranslations, things like that. And so doing this study, I quickly started seeing stuff. I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense at all. And then you've brought up some good points tonight as well, as far as certain words being used and why, Matthew. So thank you, absolutely, thank you for your study on that.
Hey, no problem. The feeling is mutual. I love both of you brothers. This is one of the things that, and this may be good as we're wrapping it up to say, is that we all agree that, I like to say here in the South, the hitching post is the law and the prophets. That's my hitching post. That's what I'm pulling everything from. So when I'm reading the New Testament, it's not that I think the New Testament is invalid. It's that I'm saying, man, that doesn't line up with the Torah, or that doesn't line up with the prophets the way that I'm reading it here in English. Let me look deeper into it. I'm not reading the New Testament and then trying to change my understanding of the Torah. I'm reading the Torah
Right.
and the prophets first, and then adapting my New Testament understanding to that. It's kind of like when we're discussing these what's called extra biblical books, or people call apocryphal books. It's not that we're just pulling things out of thin air. We're seeing, how do they jive with the law and the prophets. If they don't, hey, then you ain't got to worry about it. But if they do, we need to pay attention to what they're saying.
yeah, that's a diligent method of hermeneutics, brother.
So one last question for both of you guys. Let's go in here to, I think it's in Luke, where he's showing himself to the disciples, and he kind of tells them, "Hey, I told you that I would have to be raised according to the scriptures." Do you guys remember what verse that is?
Is that the road to Emmaus?
Is that Luke 24:6 maybe?
Yeah, I think is it Luke 24?
So it says in verse 6, he is not here, but he's risen. Remember how he spoke to you while he was still in Galilee, saying that the Son of Man must be delivered in the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. That's talking to Mary at the tomb. The angel said that apparently. And then, or no, he said that, I guess. Yeah, because she thought he was the gardener. But then later, as he's talking to the two guys on the road to Emmaus, he mentions this as well in verses 13 through 27. So, what are you guys' thoughts on that? What scriptures is he referring to that he said? And what is it? Well, let me stop that question. Let's try a different slant. What's the third day he's referring to in those passages?
I believe it's a reference to Abib 16th. I think it's the third day counting from Passover. I think Passover is the first day. Sabbath on the 15th is the second day. Abib 16 is the third day. I think that this is not only talked about in Luke 24, third day. I think this is what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says he rose the third day according to the scriptures. I think the 1-2 sequence is Passover, the first day of unleavened bread, Sabbath, 16th, first day of the week. And I think that the Hebrew audience would know that because of the feasts that were being kept by them. So I think that's the scriptural reference myself.
Okay, so wait, Matthew, you are saying the 14th is its own day unto itself, as far as being a part of the feasts of counting 7 days?
No. I think when we're talking about the third day resurrection, like according to the scriptures, or when Yeshua says, don't you know, or the angel says, don't you know that he would have to rise on the third day? I think that's a reference to 14th, 15th, 16th. Not that the 14th is the first day of unleavened bread, but it's the first day in the third day sequence of Yeshua's rising from the dead. He was put to death on the 14th. He laid in the tomb on the 15th, Sabbath, resurrected on the 16th, 1, 2, 3. I think that's the reference that is being made in Luke 24. I think that's what Paul's talking about, rising the third day according to the scriptures.
That's interesting, because I'd actually entertained that idea when I was making my chart. I'm wondering if the reference of the third day mentioned something about, but I didn't include the 14th as day one. I was thinking more of the third day of unleavened bread, because it's a 7-day festival. And so, but
yeah, and I believe that it was 3 24-hour periods.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at with that. Sean, where in Luke 24 did you see him saying that you must rise on the third day? Where's that reference in that?
It's both in verse 6, and also if we look down during the walk to Emmaus conversation, it's in verse
21.
And yeah, verse 21. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it's the third day since these things happen.
Yeah.
So it doesn't directly tell it that he's rising on the third day there, but it's why he's, in my opinion, it's why he starts to mention the idea of explaining himself through the scriptures and revealing himself to them, because it was the third day.
Yeah, and that's what I brought up to you earlier before we started the broadcast about how I think it's in John where it talks about, like, he says that after 3 days, according to the scriptures, right, I'll be risen type thing. And I don't see that anywhere in what we would consider the scriptures, that direct reference of him saying after 3 days I will rise. So it's an extra biblical book, in my opinion. It's out there for us to understand.
Yeah,
but
I think it, and I don't want to repeat my whole thing, but I think it has to do with an understanding of the feast, how the feast works out from Passover to Wave Sheaf Day. I think that's where he's pulling from. I think it's something that the immediate audience would have understood easily. Us 2,000 years removed, that haven't always kept the feasts, we kind of boggles. Where's this in the scriptures? Not that we can't figure it out, but we weren't raised as Hebrews, where generation to generation had kept the feast days. So yeah,
it's hard for us, but it's awesome because the Father is waking us up to these ancient truths, and
amen.
I enjoy it. It's frustrating at times. I'll be honest. I get super frustrated as soon as, like I said, as soon as you think that you've got your finger on something, it's like more information comes, which dismantles that. So it can be super frustrating. And I just want to encourage you, brothers and sisters, who thank you for watching, who are still here and who are going to watch this broadcast after it's done being live, to just trust the Father and be patient, and because he's patient with you, he's patient with all of us. So we're all on a learning curve, and some of us have started earlier, some of us have started later in the game, but as long as we're waking up, starting somewhere, he just wants our hearts in regards to that. So
yes, guys, I'm trying to go through the chat. For whatever reason, my chat's not working very well, so I haven't been able to participate throughout this whole broadcast with the chat at all, and I can't even see if there's any good questions in here or comments that we might need to address. So I was hoping that we could have a small interactive portion at the end of the video, but unfortunately, I can't see anything in here.
It's quite a bit of conversation going on, Sean. I'm just looking back on it now.
And unfortunately, I don't see, from what I can see, I don't see any direct questions to us. So I know there's people obviously that's going to disagree. I've seen the disagreements with what we've been talking about. And people are talking to themselves about different things. But yeah, I'm sorry, guys, if I missed your question. I didn't see any, and for whatever reason, I have technical issues apparently. But I do want to thank everybody for joining us. I think it's been a productive conversation, and it's been enjoyable for me. Not just productive; it's been enjoyable because it's really rare that you can find two brothers that are willing to discuss scriptures and not just dig your heels in pridefully. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Being able to discuss them in a sense of patience. And being willing to, because I just want to know the truth, man. Like if I'm completely wrong on something, good, because that means I'm closer to the truth, right? So like that's,
Yeah,
I just want to know the
likewise.
truth. And I appreciate you guys. I think you'll have the same disposition. So that's why I feel honored to call you guys brothers. And I think this has been great. Any concluding remarks you guys like to talk about before we sign off?
Yeah, I just like I said, I want to encourage people to just look into the feast days themselves and like don't get overly militant on things. Like it's good to figure out a stance and stick to that, but always be willing to learn, always be willing to test things. And like I said, the Father is gonna, when he sends Yeshua on the day of the Lord, I think the calendar is gonna get reset. And that's another part of this discussion I didn't want to bring up, Sean, is the calendar debates, because that can be included in this too. And I know there's probably some people in the comments that have brought it up, but in my opinion, everything's going to get reset. We're going to be doing things properly when Yeshua comes back. So we're the children of the Father, and he wants to see us doing these Moedim as best that we can. So just do that.
I agree with Ken. I think you study to the best of your ability in the here and now, and you're faithful to what you see, but you're not faithful to the point where you condemn everybody that doesn't see it exactly like you see it. So the feast days roll around, and usually you have 3, sometimes 4 different days where people are keeping Passover or a certain new moon or something like that, and you see people kind of butting heads over that kind of stuff. And it's okay to discuss it, and it's okay to have disagreements. But when Yeshua returns, yeah, there's going to be a reset button. Just like when the Israelites were delivered out of the land of Egypt, one of the first things that Yahweh spoke to Moses in Exodus 12, he said, "This month will be the beginning of months to you. This will be the first month of the year." And I think it's probably because in Egypt, that wasn't the first month of the year. They weren't doing things like that. So just be humble with people, and you can disagree and you can be adamant about your position, but when it's through, I like to tell people, don't throw somebody in the lake over it. Talking about the lake of fire.
That's Yahweh's job at the end of the millennial reign. Yeah.
Yeah, it truly is interesting what you see out there as far as folks that they've yet to learn the maturity of brotherhood. Just being able to walk with brothers in patience and love and respect, regardless of disagreements. And it's we see the disciples of Yeshua disagreeing, but they still remained a part of his disciples and remained in the group, right? And there's points where they disagree with each other and got angry with each other because of certain things. And so yeah, I just think it's definitely something for us to learn in our discipleship, is to adopt the disposition of Yeshua, who went to those who vehemently disagreed with him, and he was able to speak to them and offer them sound wisdom and instruction. But he didn't have to get caught up in their drama. He walked away at times when he needed to. But ultimately, he kept his peace about him. And because he knew how to walk in wisdom while trying to offer the wisdom of the Father's words at every place, at every chance he could. And I think that's just such an admirable trait for us to follow as believers. And so I appreciate you guys for sharing that disposition as well.
Yeah,
and
ditto, brother. Ditto.
Love you, man.
Other than that, we're going to sign off, guys. Thanks for being in the chat, and thank you for joining us tonight on this this last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And if you're watching this and you see some places where we missed the mark on something, or we didn't include something that you thought we should have, go ahead and put it in the comments. And as always, if this was an edifying discussion for you that led you to some good thoughts or some good investigation into this topic, make sure to like the video. Please tell us you're even here. Sign in the comments, and also you share it on social media and help us get the word out. So, and if you guys have not visited these two brothers' own channels, they have their own channels on YouTube. Go to Hanging on His Words. That's Ken's channel. He's got his big banner behind him. And then you've got Matthew Jansen's got his own channels, Ministers of the New Covenant. That's right, Matthew, right?
Correct. ministersnewcovenant.org.
There it is. Go check them out, guys. Show them some love. They both have some great videos that you could learn from. So we appreciate you being here tonight, and we hope that you will you'll be here for us when we sign on live next time. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, guys. We'll see you later.
See ya.